Well, Bernadette, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Oh, pretty good. Trying to stay warm in this winter weather.
Aren't we all? So I'm going to ask you my favorite question to ask all my guests. What's the best piece of advice you ever received?
Well, I think from my father, embrace challenges. He was always one that says never shy away from challenges. And when things come your way that's unexpected, just embrace them and look at them as opportunities to grow, not something to fret or fear.
Oh, I love that. That's so good. Because, challenges will come. Again, somebody else said about the same, kind of along those same lines of, life gives you lemons. What do you do with it? Do you make lemonade or do you just suck on a sour lemon? So
For sure, for sure.
So I'm curious, as you think about your life and people who have been important to you, who were some people who maybe served to inspire you or be a mentor for you along your journey?
Well, I would have to say, given the advice I just shared with you from my father, that he's one of them. He came from humble beginnings. He never had more than a high school diploma, but yet he became very successful in the federal government in the mine safety industry. So he was very driven and he didn't let obstacles get in his way. And even though he had limited formal education, he really inspired me to just strive for to and, in the church as well, he was always either mowing the lawn at the church or he became active in boards, school boards for the diocese, mission boards for the diocese. So I always saw him active as the church being a center of his life. And, also along with that, when I was trying to decide what career path I wanted to go into after college, I did a volunteer year. And in that year, they assigned me to a small church in rural West Virginia, believe it or not. Never thought I'd come full circle and end up back in West Virginia. But there was this little nun, little sister, religious sister running the parish. And she just had so many, the people loved her. She did a great job in keeping people, organized. She'd go out and evangelize and was committed to social justice. And she inspired me to say, hey, I could do that. Even though I'm a woman, even though I can still be a leader in the Catholic Church, just in a different sort of way. And that sort of led me in my career path that, has sustained me to this day.
That's great. So I see you just completed your PhD. Tell us a little bit about what your PhD area of study was.
Well, it was actually interesting. I was never really looking for a PhD, believe it or not. And we were actually at the diocese, and going through some really tough times. As you know, the Catholic Church has experienced a lot of scandal. We had a bishop who was doing improper things on many levels, and he was ousted. And I was very, very down. I went through those stages of grief when you mourn and you get angry. And then I got a postcard in the mail that said, come and learn about the instructional management leadership program at Robert Morris University in Pittsburgh. And I'm like, why me? Why did this come to me? But as I started thinking about it, I'm like, who knows more about dysfunctional leadership at this moment than me? And I was living through it. And I said, rather than grieving and being angry and emotional, do something productive. So I said, I want to study leadership. I knew when I went into the program that I wanted to do something on church leadership because that was what I was passionate about at the time. But then, as I started getting into the program and meeting with mentors and stuff, they're like, you have to stop being angry. You have to stop letting your emotions take over. And you have to look at this critically and academically. So I had a come to Jesus moment and I bracketed all of my, anger and emotion and said, this is a real problem. And the more I started talking to people in in our surrounding dioceses, the more I realized this is an issue that really needs some reflection and some study. And so that's what I did. So 3 years later, I got my PhD and my dissertation was on Roman Catholic priests, the need for leadership and management training. And it was a really proud accomplishment.
I know when I did my research, I came across some surprising results. I came in with, this hypothesis of what I was trying to investigate, but found some things that I was not expecting. So, what was the most surprising part of your research?
Well, I think the surprising thing was there's that desire for leadership and management training. Everyone knows that it's a problem. The seminaries know it's a problem. The seminarians, knew it was a problem. The priests knew it was a problem. So the awareness of the problem, but how are there initiatives to help solve the problem? And there were, there are programs out there, leadership development programs and tools for priests, and there's different ideas that were floating through. So I thought that was very surprising that while they they admit that there's a problem, there's an openness to change and to realize that priests do need to, and church leaders do need training, and they do need to continue to grow and develop. And that was something positive, but that was something that I found.
I know when I work a lot, being a pastor myself, we struggle with the idea, are we leaders or are we shepherds? And I'm sure you have the same issue in the Catholic Church as well. What do you believe are some of the core skills that priests and pastors need to be effective church leaders?
Well, I think you're right. There are two different set of skills. There's a shepherding, there's the spiritual side, and there's helping them grow spiritually and close to God. But then there's also those day-to-day tasks of being a leader and building up the congregation and meeting the temporal needs of the parish and the church and making sure it functions properly. So I think there's that balance where I think that priests tend to be so bogged down in that leadership management, that day to day administrative work, that they forget about the spiritual side. So I think you're right, it's a delicate tightrope to walk, that they have to be spiritual and realize that they're leading people to God and and to help them to spread the mission of the church. On the other hand, they have to realize how to juggle those other responsibilities. And so I think it's a balancing act, and they have to, what I'm going to suggest is that they do more delegating and more discerning and looking at people in their parish that can help them with these administrative tasks because they want to do spiritual things. One of the biggest findings in my research was that priests said, I didn't sign up to be a janitor. I didn't sign up to be a maintenance man. I didn't sign up to be a finance budget planner. I signed up to be a spiritual advisor, to walk with people on their journey to Christ, to be prayerful and to be there at deathbeds and to be there for funerals. And instead I'm bogged down, with these other things. And so that's really tough. And that's a challenge that I think is unique to church leaders.
You're right. And I think the other thing I noticed too is, in my seminary training, we had one class on pastor as administrator. So it was a 3-hour class. It was in
Exactly.
our fourth year. And at
Yes,
that point, you just were thinking about where's your first assignment. You're going to be in
exactly.
ministry, not necessarily. But we didn't learn how to run meetings. We
No,
didn't learn how to set up budgets or even
exactly.
advise leaders to do that. What strategies have you figured out that work well to help pastors develop skills in their members? Because that's important. If you want to delegate, you got to make sure your people are qualified.
Exactly.
How do you help develop those leaders around you?
Well, I think you have to, big important thing is in the Catholic Church is gift discernment. You have to be, the pastor has to be attentive to every gift that the parishioners have. I know that's a big task with large congregations, but with those smaller congregations, especially where they're most in need of these resources, they need to look at the parish and say, who do I have that's really come out and really, I can really trust, like if you have a bank president in your parish, your congregation, why don't you make him part of your financial advisor and help you with the finances? But being attentive to the gifts that people bring to the table, you just have to be very observant. And I think, coming back to the spiritual side, you have to be really attentive to the Holy Spirit. I believe that's critical. And that's something that I've been really passionate about, working with listening and just listening, be observant. I think we're so busy in this culture, do, but we're not stopping and stepping back and looking around and listening to the voice of the Spirit, which takes time and patience. But I think there's creative ways that pastors can do this, and it can be effective. But you're right. I chuckled when you said about the seminary training, because that's what I found in my dissertation research, that they are given one course on pastoral administration. While ideally, for at least for the Catholic Church, with the shortage of priests, is to have the priest like be an associate. I don't know what you all have in your congregation, if you have where the priest is a newly ordained priest or minister, and they walk alongside a seasoned priest, and they're at the parish learning on the job training, but they're not solely responsible. Now we have guys coming out of seminary, and then they make them in charge of a parish, and they don't know the first thing about the management side and the leadership side, and that's unfortunate. So I don't know how we do that. Seminary rectors I've talked to said, well, we have to cram it all in. We have to get so many theologies, so many scriptures, so many philosophies. We don't have time for one more course. So if they're not getting that in seminary, and they're being ordained and going right into that parish setting, we're doing a disservice to them.
Yeah, and our model during our seminary training, early years, the first 2 years, we are assigned to a local parish for on Sunday morning. So we're kind of
Yeah,
field work
yeah,
students, but you're really typically only there maybe on Sunday. Maybe there's an event during the week, but you're typically just there on the weekend.
yeah.
So you don't really learn as much during
No,
that time. Then we have a year of vicarage where you go off and spend a year at a church where you may learn more of hands-on things.
yeah,
Again, that's kind of hit and miss depending upon
that,
the supervisor, the church you're in. And a lot of our pastors, we have the same kind of a shortage. Their first call is not as an associate. Their first
yeah,
call is to
exactly.
sometimes a dual parish or even a smaller parish. Very few become associates. So you're right. With that in mind, though, how do we, and the seminary is struggling with that too, how do you balance the formal education with experiential learning? Because we don't, if you're not in a place where someone comes along, here's how you run a meeting, here's how you lead. We had no classes when I was at seminary on stewardship. And you're supposed to walk in all of a sudden know how to do stewardship in a congregation. So, how do you
Yeah.
balance all that?
And that's the challenge, and that's what I think we need to look towards these other programs. We need to provide support for church leaders, and I don't know if that's happening. And I think you're right that need has to be met somehow. And I think we have to look to outside organizations and dioceses. I know you all have more formal structures as well. Maybe we have to look at those for resources, because you're right, the seminaries can't add anything more to their plate. So where are they getting this kind of training? And I agree that it's a challenge that we need to be alerted to and be aware for the future.
So it really kind of falls a lot on the pastor himself. So as you think about what you've been studying, how can leaders stay adaptable and responsive to the changing needs of their congregations?
Well, I think they have to be open to change, and we've talked about that before. That change is very difficult, and people that are stuck in the old model that the priest does everything and the father's in charge of everything, so that mindset can no longer operate in this culture. And we have to be able to think outside the boat, like we said, outside the box. My father used to say, "Get out the boat." Jesus called Peter to get out of the boat and to go into that uncharted territory, which we need to do too. But we need to prepare the priest for that. So if there's a way that seminary can open them to this whole bigger picture of, it's the human side, the intellectual side, the pastoral side, and open them up to being adaptable and being open to change, I think the seminaries have to foster that kind of attitude. Because when they get out, if they're not adaptable, if they're not ready to face changes, if they're not ready to ask the big questions, then we're in for some trouble.
What kind of after seminary support does the Catholic Church provide for young pastors?
Well, and that I think is an issue as well. There are outside organizations, like right now, diocese has contracted a Catholic Leadership Institute, and they have an outside consultant come in, do leadership development, leadership coaching with our priests. And I think it's those programs right now that have the best success rate. But again, they're costly. Does a bishop know about them? So they have some challenges too. So what I found in my dissertation research is the diocese really needs to be that support. Like, where I work in the liturgy side of it. So if a priest has a question about liturgy, they call me and I'll answer the question. But we have an HR person, we have a CFO, we have accountants. So if they have issues, they need to know who to call for help and not to be afraid to ask those questions and to seek out those resources. But you're right, they have to be made aware that they exist, and that's another challenge.
Yeah, and especially with the shortage of pastors. I know we're experiencing a lot of clergy burnout. Are you guys also,
Yes,
how are you
exactly.
handling worker wellness in your
Well,
organization?
I don't think that we are addressing that. We work them till you're right, till they, drop over. I mean, unfortunately, that's the case. But again, if we learn how to parcel out those responsibilities and don't expect them to be chief maintenance man, chief CFO, chief, and we let them look to other people for those administrative tasks, then I think, and let them do that spiritual side. I think that is critical. But, pastors have to be willing to let go and to delegate. And like you said, be able to, who can I trust? The trust is a big issue. If I trust this person with my finances and they go run off or embezzle the funding, how am I, how, so they're ultimately responsible. So I think that level of responsibility can, cause burnout because you're responsible. My dad used to tell me, you look at bishops, they're in charge of multi-million-dollar corporations with all that money and finances, and yet they don't know a thing about finances and a thing about managing a corporation. So you're right. How do you balance the shepherding and the leadership? How do you balance the pastoral and the temporal? So I think those are challenges that the church has to face. And you're right. I don't think we have enough resources yet to provide that. And they are getting burned out because they are expected to do everything, be everything to all people, and they just can't. They're human.
Yeah, I think it hit me for reality check when I looked at the um our state um form we had to fill out and it said who was like who's basically serving as the CEO of this organization, and my name was on there. I'm like, wait a minute,
Yes,
if this goes wrong, I'm the one going to prison. So it's like we had to make
exactly.
sure we make
Exactly.
sure all of our T's were crossed and our I's were dotted. 'Cause like I am not going to prison.
But I'm sure if you're a young seminarian with, bright-eyed about sharing the gospel and teaching Jesus's message, and then you realize, oh, I'm a CEO of a corporation. I'm in charge of these finances. I have to run a meeting. You're making me fire the secretary because she's not showing up. That's not what they expected. My dad said in some sense we're setting them up for failure. And I think that's why a lot of them do experience burnout because, hey, I signed on to be a spiritual leader. I didn't sign off for all this other, stuff that went along with being a leader.
Curious, what from your studies did you have any recommendations to improve the situation for the church?
Well, I think, making people aware of these organizations, trying to find leadership development opportunities designed for clergy and for church leaders, even lay church leaders. I think having these opportunities, making them available. I think also having that mentorship as much as you can. We talked about having them with the seasoned priest. I think we have to set that up. And they always said that was key. Finding someone who's been in the church for 30 years and taking a new, and doing a better job with our seminarian program. Like you said about that pastoral year, they have a year where they spend, don't just make them serve at the altar. Don't just make them, see if there's enough candles and have them sit in a finance council meeting, have them look at the budget, have them be very, very intentional about your seminary and those pastoral years and those pastoral experiences, because unless you are, like you said, they might not ever get exposed to that till, hey, I'm in this situation now, what do I do? So I think there's ways, but we have to be intentional about those ways.
Yeah, I like that. I kind of wish that there was more of a guided process for that year. Like
Yes.
the first quarter of your time, because when you just get to a parish in my vicarage year, I was just trying to figure out where the bathroom was, where my office was.
Yeah.
But if you had it broken down where you spend a quarter going to the finance meetings, where you spend a quarter working with the school if you have a school, that
Yes.
everything is intentional, that you get
Exactly.
these experiences. Because the biggest thing my bishop did was, no, we're going to make sure you preach you
Yeah,
preach a lot and you do
exactly.
liturgy.
Yeah, same here,
Once I got that, it's fine. But what happens after I never run a meeting,
Ex
or let the person run a
exactly,
meeting, set up the
exactly.
agenda. Yeah, we don't. I don't know if
Or
it's
I
that
never
intentional.
Yeah, that's what I think has to happen,
Yeah.
especially knowing that we're shortage of having these mentor priests because we don't have them anymore, but having something being intentional. And then I think the diocese has to be a resource, has to be willing to be there when the priest knows, and the priest has to know who the finance person is at the diocese, so they can call them for help, or who's the HR person. Oh yes, I need your help because I'm having a staff issue, or I'm having a budgeting problem, or I need you to come in and teach me, or we have a development office where we're fundraising. Like you said, teach me how to run a stewardship campaign. Teach me how to, if they know who those people are, they can seek them out. So I think we have to just be more intentional of supporting our clergy and our church leaders in finding support for this leaders, their leader.
Curious, what have you give me an example of effective leadership you've seen, and who played out?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting. I'm going to have to give credit to Pope Francis because, he's very revolutionary in his way of thinking, but I'm not sure if you're familiar what the Catholic Church has been doing is the Synod on Synodality, where he started in the year 2000 with these consultations from all across the country. So he listened to the people in the pew on the local level. So we all gathered together, every diocese in the whole world gathered together to listen to the people, the grassroots. And then we compiled all those reports, and then they made their way up the chain to Rome. And he sat there and he had these meetings where they sat down and they just talked and actively listened and actually actively heard what is really happening. And I think that was revolutionary. So while and he opened it up to these meetings in Rome weren't just bishops, which was the first time this ever happened. They were women and laity and young and old and sitting at the same table. So a cardinal might be sitting next to a young person from another country, and they listen to each other and talk. And I think that's one way. I think his effective leadership style in the Synod on Synodality is a model for how we should be conducting leadership and how we should be synodal leaders. And I know you all Lutherans like to use that word synod a lot. And synod, though, means journeying together, walking together, listening to one another. And, I think that's for me is a great example of what we should be doing and supporting one another and listening to each other.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't think sometimes the lay people's voice gets heard a lot, especially in
Exactly.
upper leadership. And I think it's really important for that voice to be heard. I also want to go back to something you said earlier, and I want to kind of tap into your experience. You talked about, and we have the same struggle in our Lutheran church as well, is how do we find and make use of women serving in the church? How have you kind of broken some of those guidelines to help people figure out, because like in your church body like mine, women don't serve as pastors and priests, but I think they're underutilized in terms of their ability to provide their gifts and talents to the church. Well, how have you guys effectively or continue to kind of work to get women more active in the church?
Well, and that's one of the things that came out of the synod that the Pope said that we do undervalue women. And I think for me, I was, when I was familiar with other denominations like Lutheran and other ones that do have women pastors, they would ask me, they would say, well, don't you wish you had the caller? And I said, no, I don't, because I can do things. I just have to go in a different direction. So yes, it's been hard. It's been challenging. But like I said, there are role models. There are very inspirational women like the sister that I told you about that probably inspired me to do what I do. I think I can be a role model for other people. There are a lot of women who just don't get recognized, but I think the Pope Francis has appointed women to the Roman offices in the Vatican, and I think that we're opening the doors, and I think I do think myself a revolutionary. A lot of times, I have to prove myself a little bit harder. I'll be in a room full of men, or I'll be with priests. But, I just, once I show them I know the theology of the church, I know leadership, I'm very educated. And when I speak that way, oh, we didn't know, we're sorry. The tables turn. Where it's a challenge. I think the church is getting better at it. I think with the shortage of priests, while women's ordination will, may never be, but they are looking at maybe women as the diaconate. That could happen maybe down the road. But I think women serving in leadership roles are critical. The more we have the shortage of priests.
So you work in faith formation. Kind of tell me what process is that? How does that look like in the Catholic Church? I know we have some of that in our church body as well.
Well, actually, I'm in the liturgy world. I'm
Cool.
the director of worship. So my job is even more challenging because you're right. I'm dealing with priests. I'm dealing with, telling them how to run the liturgy. And they're like, well, what are you going to tell us? And then when I know my rubrics and I know my structure, what's supposed to happen, and I know the theology behind it, they're like, whoa. So, we do have some formation. I think it struggles. I think our struggle is having an educated laity. People just don't know their faith. And, when I hear, parents don't know the basic tenets of the prayers to teach their children, that saddens me. So, where, I think we need people in more capable leadership, people to be more educated on their faith. And I don't know how we do that because right now that's not happening.
Yeah, our church body just got a grant to actually get our young people to be more connected to the liturgy. So it's kind of interesting. That's your area of focus. So that's going to be I'm kind of curious how our church body actually moves forward with that going forward, kind of getting our young people to have a deeper appreciation of the liturgy and the power the liturgy has in our life.
But I think the young people really hunger for that because, I'm
Hmm.
teaching undergrads right now, Intro to Catholic Theology for Ohio Dominican University in Columbus. And, they're hungry to tell them, what our belief systems are. And once they learn it, they're hungry for some more. But I think there's a gap that happened, and especially in the Catholic Church. In the 1960s, we had the Second Vatican Council, which was very revolutionary and changed our way of thinking, but we didn't know quite what to do with it afterwards. So there was a time when faith formation consisted of making crafts and singing Kumbaya and Jesus loves me. So it's like then they started, well, wait, we need to get back to center. So there's a whole generation, I'd say my generation, who learned those to make crosses out of popsicle sticks and didn't really engage in our faith. I think now we have this whole population of the laity who's not very formed in their faith, and then we're expecting them to teach the youth. And there's that gap. So I think trying to be more, we have to be more intentional about forming our faithful, our congregations in their faith so that they can teach it, pass it on to the next generation. Because we can't rely on culture anymore. We don't live in a Christian culture like we used to. Church is not at the center of people's world. They have sports on Sunday mornings, and it's we're competing with all these secular activities. So finding people to pass on the faith, I think, is the biggest challenge I'm seeing at the present time.
I'm curious. One of the controversies that's always going into church, especially lately, is if young people aren't in our church, we have to abandon liturgy and give them something different. Being someone who works in the liturgy field, how do you answer when churches are like, there's no young people here, we have to go bring a praise band in and get rid of all of our liturgy, historic liturgy to get young people to come? Since you work so closely with young people, tell us a little bit about how you approach that concept of, do we just throw this out and do something different?
Yeah, I hear that a lot. And I think we have to find that again, it's all about balance. I think if we bring them to a liturgy that's bad preaching, music is boring and bad. I'm not saying we have to entertain or bring a praise band in, but we have to keep our structure. And because it's very traditional, it does have a long history, and, we've preserved it this long. But I think what we have to do is look at it. Are we doing it effectively? And are we explaining what we're doing? Is there some kind of context behind it? Liturgy can be very formative, but I agree. I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old. To get them to pay attention in mass, oh, this is boring. They'd rather be punching each other and stuff. But I say no, let's listen. And then at home, they'll mimic the prayers. They'll mimic the sign of the cross. Oh, if a prayer breaks out, they'll finish it. So I think it's a teachable. The liturgy teaches and forms, but first of all, it has to be good liturgy. And second of all, we just have to stick with it and inform people of why we do what we do. And I think that's critical.
So I love to ask my guests this question. What do you want your legacy to be?
Well, I want people to realize that I was passionate about church leadership and that I'm not afraid to ask the challenging questions. And a lot of times people look at me with three heads in a meeting when I ask the challenging questions. But I do because I'm not afraid to speak out. There are times in my life when I tried to stay quiet, but the Holy Spirit won't let me stay quiet. You know how that I'm sure you've had that experience before.
Jeremiah moment, right?
I'm not gonna comment, I'm not gonna comment, I'm not gonna comment. Next thing I know, I'm commenting and the whole room goes silent. But, I feel like these questions need to be asked and these things need to be wrestled with. And, I wasn't afraid to say them and to speak out and I want to see the church grow and thrive because I think it is divinely inspired. I told one of my old bosses that I said, if I was just concentrating on the human element, I would be an atheist now because of what I've seen, how flawed human beings have operated. But I know down deep in my heart that there's something more and that Jesus is leading and driving the ship. And, we just have to stay the course.
If you had a message for the church going forward about leadership, what would it be?
Well, I think, like you said, being aware that there's a need for leadership development among clergy. They have suffering burnout. They can't be expected to be all things to all people. They have to be, you have to address the issue. And we have to realize that it is an issue and we have to do something about it going forward. I think that's what I'd like the message to be communicated because I see what happened in my own experience, what happens when it gets dysfunctional. I've seen the hurt. I've seen the anger. I've seen and something that, I'm sure you're familiar with is that people associate the church with Jesus and with God. So if something goes wrong, if I see a priest scandalizing or stealing money or sexual abusing children, that's going to affect my faith in God. And I think that holds church leaders to an even more accountability than, say, the CEO of Enron or Microsoft, because you are affecting people's relationship with God. And that's even, I think, in my opinion, that's, something horrible that we don't want to do.
Because I could just buy a different computer if I don't like Microsoft.
But, but if I abandon my faith, and I've seen a lot of people abandon their faith in God because of the church scandal, and you have to remind them it's flawed human beings. It's not the divinely instituted body of Christ. But how do you reconcile that? So church leaders have to take a good hard look at how they're operating because of that.
So is there anything I haven't asked you that I should have asked you?
Well, no, not really. I just wanted to kind of tell you what I've been up to. As you know, I've been saying about Pope Francis's Synod on Synodality. Well, I've developed a program called Gifted in the Spirit, which
Cool.
it's a leadership development program for church leaders based on those principles of synod and synodality, listening to the Spirit, a discernment, active listening, coaching, mentoring, asking the right big questions. So that's something I'm really excited about developing and making available.
So when will that be available for people to kind of check out?
Well, it's kind of in progress, so it's
Okay.
up, and I have a LinkedIn page. I have some materials on it, but I'm just trying to work it out and figure out when I can launch it.
So where can people find you and follow where the project is going and know when it's going to come out?
Yeah, they can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm there, and Bernadette McMaster's Kime and Gifted in the Spirit is my leadership development program that I'm hoping to launch.
Wow, so cool. When you get that launched, come back out and we'll talk about it and we'll delve into it some more.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Well, thanks for being such a wonderful guest and for having this conversation, an important conversation about church leadership. Because, like you said, the church is the leaders are the front lines of people kind of their first experience sometimes with Jesus. And we want that experience to be one that we know we're flawed, but that is one that doesn't lead people away from the gospel and our Savior, as opposed to leading us to Him.
Exactly.
So, blessings on what you do. And thank you for the leadership you provide.
Thank you.